All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Red Lettuce. Joining us is our long distance tanky boyfriend, Kei Pritsker, who has been on the ground in Venezuela and doing a lot of traveling. The Caribbean and Latin America is a super hot topic right now, and we're going to get into sanctions and embargoes and Twitter bots and all that good stuff. So, Eric, take it away with this first question, please.
Kay, thank you so much for joining us again. We've all seen our bourgeois media outlets post fake news about the protest happening in Cuba, along with gusanos like the mayor of Miami calling for military intervention in Cuba and propaganda talking points that aim to place all the blame on the socialist government of Cuba while ignoring or even downplaying the illegal blockade, which is the root cause. Would you say we are seeing a continuation of a 6-decade-long tactic by our government in seeking to overthrow the revolutionary socialist government of Cuba? Also, are people in Cuba responding to a social crisis instead of a political one? And explain how the blockade is designed. And explain what the blockade is designed to do and how it works.
Yeah. So I'll actually start with the last question. No, I'll start with the first question. Yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, the blockade is a 60-year-long policy. It was sort of it was implemented first in 1959, but then it sort of increased. They increased like what was being blocked, what sort of things couldn't be exported until 1961, when it became a full embargo or blockade. And yeah, I mean, in the sort of like in the State Department's documents when they're basically like in 1958 or 1959 or no, 1960, excuse me, when they're sort of like discussing the merit of this policy, you can read, if you read this document, it's in one of the videos I made about the first video I made about Cuba. And it basically says like the point of this policy, they're actually discussing the policy. So they're saying, the only way to crush the Cuban Revolution is to crush it economically, to make it to choke the economy, to make the economy suffer until people don't have jobs, they don't have money, they don't have purchasing power, and people are so in such a bad position, they're in such a destitute position that they blame the government and they blame socialism, and they hopefully, in the eyes of the United States, they hopefully overthrow the government. So, I mean, that's the basic idea behind economic sanctions and blockades. And yeah, I mean, the United States is continuing this policy. They have continued this policy for 60 years, and they're not dropping it. Donald Trump implemented 243. He implemented 243 new measures that increase the strength of the blockade, that make it harder for Cuban families to send remittances back home, that further restrict U.S. travel to Cuba. So Joe Biden hasn't dropped any of these things. He supports Trump's policy on this, and So to answer the last question, it's not even a secret like what this blockade is about. It was at one time, for most of the history of the blockade, it was a very open like reason why they were implementing this blockade. Like there was no secret. Of course, it was about overthrowing the Cuban government. I mean, that was a matter of U.S. policy, was to overthrow the Cuban government, and they did more than just blockade Cuba. They tried to assassinate Fidel Castro 632 times, and they failed every time. Which is just amazing. There were other plans, like people should Google Operation Northwoods if they've never heard of that. This was a plan that came to John F. Kennedy's desk from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He didn't sign off on it, but the plan basically was to stage like false flag terrorist attacks, to detonate bombs in Miami, to sink U.S. ships and blame it on Cuba as a pretext to go to war with Cuba. So, the United States has always wanted to overthrow Cuba, and I'm sure we'll talk a little more about why. But and the other part of this question, which I think is an important one, is yes, like this is absolutely a response to the protests. What I mean when I say this, the protests in Cuba, the anti-government protests, are they're a reaction to the social conditions that the blockade has created. You know, and if you want to know why it's happening now, I mean, the blockade has been in place for 60 years, but the reason it's happening now is really, you know, a big part of it is COVID, because Cuba has had a sort of spike in COVID cases, like a lot of countries. A lot of countries are experiencing a second or third wave. You know, there's, you know, new variants of the virus. So Cuba's facing that right now, and people are upset because there aren't enough vaccines. Well, why aren't there enough vaccines? Because Cuba's under blockade. There actually aren't enough syringes to inject the vaccines. Cuba's invented 5 COVID vaccines, and they have enough doses, but they can't administer them because they don't have the syringes to inject the vaccines into people's arms. So like the shortage of vaccine supply is entirely a product of the blockade. So that's one of the reasons people are protesting. And then, you know, things are very difficult too, also because of COVID plus the blockade. Because of COVID, you know, people aren't traveling to Cuba. That was a huge industry for Cuba, was tourism. And without US dollars and foreign money coming in from tourism, that was like one of the main industries for Cuba. So, I mean, it's not exactly, you know, people are blaming the Cuban government as if they have control over like the fact that people don't want to travel during COVID, or the fact that there's this blockade on them. I mean, they have no control over it. So people are, you know, responding to real problems there, but they're blaming the wrong culprit. They're blaming the government, but the real culprit is the United States, which is blockading them during a pandemic.
So, okay, how do these blockades and sanctions and embargoes work? How is the United States able to get away with this?
Yeah, so they work basically. Honestly because the United States is the largest, most powerful country in the world, largest economy, I should say, not geographically, but they have the largest economy in the world, and for that reason, they have huge influence in the world economy. I mean, not to mention the fact that they literally built the sort of like international economic system that we live in today. You know, they built the IMF and the World Bank, and the whole Bretton Woods system was conceived by the United States. But that's, you know, a topic for another day. But the United States has the largest economy in the world, which means that every country more or less has business with the United States, and that includes Cuba and Venezuela. You know, they trade, or they did trade at some point with the United States, but like that has greatly decreased because of these blockades. But every country in the world trades with the United States. You have to, because it's such a large economy. And the way the United States leverages this and takes advantage of it is by saying any country or company that sends a ship to Cuba, that docks a ship in Cuba, cannot dock that same ship, can't dock ships in US ports for 6 months. So, you know, given that choice between choosing, you know, between trading with the United States, the largest economy in the world, and little old Cuba, like the decision is clear for a lot of countries. I mean, they have no choice really. So that's the way it works. There's no legal process to it. The United States just unilaterally declares, "Hey, this is what we're going to do," and I mean, they're basically holding a gun to the head of the entire world and saying, "Hey, if you do this, we're going to punish you too. So, you know, you better behave exactly the way we want you to." And you know, the reason they get away with this is the same reason the United States gets away with everything, is because they're backed up by the largest military in the world. I mean, if any country objects to this in any serious way, if they're willing to take on the fines and the economic penalties that come with not trading with the United States or with trading with Cuba, even if they're willing to forego that 6 months of trade and pay fines to the United States, they're probably going to end up like, you know, they're going to end up like all the other sanctioned countries. They're going to get sanctioned too. They're going to end up like Iran, and they're going to end up like Venezuela and Cuba and the DPRK and Syria and every country that the United States has just bullied. And no, you know, a lot of countries don't want to end up like that, but some really don't have a choice because, you know, for a number of reasons, because of domestic factors, because of who's in their country, you know. And Yeah, so it's entirely illegal, and it's kind of like I'm not just like the United Nations literally votes on this every year, which is like really like this part is just what blows my mind every time I hear it. 29 years in a row, the United Nations has almost unanimously voted to condemn the US blockade of Cuba, to condemn it. The General Assembly. So this is every country in the world that's a member to the United Nations. And they vote every year, like 184 to 2 was this year, 187 to 3, 191 to 0 actually one year when the United States abstained. But literally every single year, the only countries that object to it are the United States and Israel, like the two apartheid settler colonies. And then everyone else is like, this is really fucked up. And then the United States and Israel are like, no, this is good.
This is
So,
fine.
no, literally no one in the world supports this except for the United States, which is why it's beyond illegal. It's been, it's very widely condemned, and I think, you know, the sort of US hubris and just their arrogance around this issue is really just, coming to the surface now.
Right. Something else I think that's coming to the surface uh, is that like a lot of progressives in the Democratic Party are saying that, oh, we don't support these embargoes and sanctions in Cuba, but we condemn uh, the crackdown on the democratic protests, which uh, just they're showing their, it's like mask off, right, they're like, and then people like we know are repeating, they're parroting that, and they don't think that the people have control of over the government there. It's really quite frustrating.
Yeah, it's really crazy to see how like some politicians are speaking out more vocally in favor of the protests in Cuba than they are like protests in the United States, literally in their own country. Like Joe Biden called on the Cuban government to respect peaceful protesters, but he was the one who said, "Oh, like we shouldn't shoot protesters in the head. We should shoot them in the
Even the
legs.
like,
Like just immobilize them and make sure they can't walk." Like
Yeah.
it's so ridiculous. I mean, even like, progressive, relatively progressive people like AOC are fully like supporting. They support the protests. Like it's so ridiculous. I saw people like Mark Lamont Hill, like who I used to admire like a lot. He's very vocal on Palestine, is speaking out against like, he's like condemning the corruption and the, crackdown of the Cuban government. I mean, do people not see the connection between Cuba and Palestine, like the long historic solidarity? Point being, I think there's a lot. It just goes to show how deep the sort of anti-communist, not just like brainwashing and the sort of the anti-communist history of the United States is, but there's so much like cultural pressure, even if you're, a progressive or a whatever, like the pressure to not align yourself with a socialist or communist country is so heavy. Like you might even call yourself a socialist, but someone like Bernie Sanders, for example, but then, you have to distance yourself from a socialist country that has, the most doctors per capita in the world, that has 100% literacy rate, that's inventing like 5 COVID vaccines, that literally has a higher life expectancy than the United States. It's just like, it's so ridiculous. And yeah, I mean, there were I read a headline I read a headline today that said 10,000 protesters were arrested within the first week of the uprising last summer after George Floyd was killed. Like literally within 10 days, they arrested 10,000 people. Like, give me a fucking break about a crackdown. Are you kidding me? Like, it, it I saw it. It's ridiculous too, because like these protests, like the protesters, like they killed a police officer in Cuba. Like it's not like they're completely nonviolent either. Like if you protest in the United States, like even if you're unarmed, even no matter what you're doing, if you're a journalist there, just like walking around covering it, like you could get arrested, you get tear gas, you get shot. and then the cops come out later and say, "Oh, well, you shouldn't have been there." Da da da. Like, I mean, these people they killed a police officer in Cuba, and you know, they're still I mean, the protests are really dying down, but there's still people like I saw a video of a guy walking around with a sign that said Libertad, and he like these protests are allowed to happen. I mean, the president Miguel Diaz-Canel even met with them. Like he literally went to the
Right.
protest and was like, "Hey, like I want to talk to you. Like we want to change things." And I believe I'm forgetting off the top of my head. I think they loosened some of the yes, they loosened some of the measures on like not remittances, but like aid that could be sent to Cuba. Like the Cuban government's already responded to these protests to some degree with like reforms or I guess you could say like concessions to the protests. So
Didn't they do that in Hong Kong too? Like some of their demands were met, and they still like.
I'm trying to think. I don't know. I don't know if they. I maybe. I mean that sounds right. I mean Hong Kong's another example. I mean every time there's a protest in a country that the U.S. wants to sort of overthrow the government in, it's just like I remember there was like a giant headline the first day, like this was like years into the Hong Kong protests because they were going on for years. I mean there was a lot of attention on it last year, but people have been protesting in Hong Kong for years, and it was like the first time that a police officer shot his gun, and it was like all over the U.S. media, like Hong Kong police shoot at protesters. I mean, people literally like they shoot tear gas and rubber bullets at protesters in the U.S. Like that's like a part of the routine. Like
Yeah.
last summer, the big question was like, "Hey, like, did you get tear gassed or not this summer? Did you get shot at or not this summer?"
And I think that the Cuban government has already made some reforms and that actually responded to the people there. That's the opposite of what happened here. If you look at what our demands were last summer, if anything, Joe Biden increased all of that. Like he increased um, the border patrol budget, the ICE budget, there's more money for police. It's
Given nice gifts to Raytheon.
yeah, like more military spending. It's the exact opposite. So again, I think this kind of shows what a dictatorship of the proletariat looks like versus the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie looks like.
Yep. Yeah. I think Joe Biden proposed increasing funding to police, and like he's proposing there were a record number of arrests at the border. He's trying to send more weapons to Israel. He like all the things like people are protesting for and demanding, he just does the opposite of. It's I mean he called for like he told Haitians not to come here. Like it's like he's doing shit like people don't even ask him to do. Like he's just like, how can I come up with more ways to piss people off? Like he
Yeah.
was supposed to be the change candidate or whatever. Like he's not, oh, I'm not like Trump. I'm not gonna like arrest kids at the border or whatever. Like it's so ridiculous. And I think it just kind of goes to show like when we talk about a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, like politics really isn't in the control of people like Joe Biden. It's not in the control of the politicians. Like the politicians are bought and paid for,
Right.
and ultimately, as soon as you get in office, even if you are some kind of reformer, like people come to you and they say, "Hey, like that's not the way we're gonna do things." Like, it's not really in anyone's control, and there are more powerful forces at play, like the military-industrial complex and Wall Street.
So, given like all of what you've just said, we're making other connections here, like we brought up Hong Kong, but where else is this style of economic warfare being applied on anti-imperialist and socialist states? Where do we see this like happening right now? Also,
Yeah, I mean, a third of the world is under sanctions actually, which is like crazy. But it's all sort of anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, socialist countries. So there's Cuba, Venezuela, China, Syria, Iran, Russia, TPRK, North Korea, Zimbabwe, Palestine, um, Lebanon to some degree is affected by sanctions on Syria. Uh, they like Trump even threatened to sanction countries in the EU for not wanting to for wanting to trade with China. Um, I mean, it's so expansive. But yeah, it's all countries that to some degree want to form some kind of alternative. Oh, and Nicaragua. Sorry, I forgot about Nicaragua. These are all countries that want to form a sort of multipolar world. Really, is like the common thread, and I think that's an important thing to talk about because they're not all socialists, and they all have varying, you know, they have different sort of political economies. They have different motives, but I think one thing that unites all of them is that they don't want this world that's dominated by one country, the United States. They want a multipolar world, and they have independence to some degree, or they have independent ambitions. They have independent foreign policies. Uh, yeah, so it's not. It might not even be that they're socialist. It might just be that they oppose like a U.S. project in their own region, and that is enough to get them in trouble. To get them, to put them in the crosshairs of the United States. Like I think Iran's a great example. Iran's not a socialist country, but Iran Iran's definitely an anti-imperialist country, mainly because the United States. I mean, the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It was born out of U.S. imperialism. It was born out of this puppet Shah that the U.S. put in place to replace this nationalist leader of Iran, Mossadegh. They replaced him with a total U.S. puppet who, gave away the natural wealth of the country, who repressed the communists and who repressed protesters, who was, who had close diplomatic relations with Israel, was like best friends with Israel. The modern sort of Islamic Republic was born out of like a rebellion against that. So the whole country's history is painted by U.S. imperialism, and of course the United States then sicked Iraq against. They sicked Saddam Hussein, who was paid by the CIA to destroy the Islamic Revolution. So that's one example. It's not like Iran's. It's not like they're socialists, but the United States is afraid of the fact that they just support the resistance movements in the region. They support Hezbollah. They're against ISIS and Al Qaeda, which are often used as U.S. proxies in the regions. They support the Palestinians and oppose Israel. So even doing that alone, like even asserting national sovereignty for yourself and for the Arab region is enough to the Arab and I guess Persian people is enough to get Iran in trouble and subject to crippling sanctions. Like Iran is really struggling because of the sanctions they're under. And I mean, there's so many other countries. The DPRK is under a full blockade. Russia is being sanctioned for like accusations that literally have no basis, like about election hacking. So anything you do that upsets the U.S.'s sort of plans for your region is a sanctionable offense.
Yeah, and just like turning toward Venezuela. Venezuela is another socialist country that's being strangled by U.S. sanctions. You were there recently. Tell us about your experience there and how are U.S. sanctions impacting the country and its socialist projects?
Yeah, we saw like so I made I made videos about each of the sort of sites that we were taken to, but one was a sort of housing commune, one was a computer factory, and then the other was a sort of like very nice housing development. But every people have to understand sanctions, like they say like sanctions are smart sanctions or whatever, they target like corrupt elites. They just they affect every single aspect of life in a country because let's say they sanction like a finance minister, but that finance minister has access to all of the country's bank accounts. And if that guy can't move money, then the whole country is cut off from, its entire national wealth. It can't conduct international transactions, and it can't trade. That is essentially, I mean, that's how a lot of the sanctions on Venezuela work. I mean, Venezuela, like Cuba, cannot trade with any countries that also want to trade with the United States. So the way this impacts Venezuela is like, I mean, literally everything that they, first of all, they don't have access to a lot of resources, but second, the countries that do trade with them, that it's so expensive for them to even buy these things. Like the housing commune I went to, the construction of the commune was stopped. Like they weren't building anything because it was so expensive to import cement and wood and bricks that they had to stop. Like, there was a computer factory that we went to it was built under Hugo Chavez's sort of government back when the government wasn't sanctioned and had money. They built this factory to provide laptops to all Venezuelan school children. I mean, it was like really, it was amazing. Like it was recognized by UNESCO as like this amazing program to get school children like school books or like resources. Like the school books were uploaded onto the computers, and they would import the parts and build the computers in this factory. They can't, the factory is operating at 10% capacity. I mean, they don't build computers anymore because the sanctions, they're not even allowed to import computer parts, even if they want to, and even if they can pay for them, they're not allowed to import them because of that rule I talked about with Cuba. Same thing applies to Venezuela. Even if a country wants to sell Venezuela computer parts, they're not allowed to do it. So, Venezuela, there are some orders that they put out, like that they've already paid for that they haven't had fulfilled yet. They haven't received the computer parts because of the sanctions. So, this is what sanctions are targeting in Venezuela is housing. It's targeting laptops and school kids. It's targeting the CLAP program, like very explicitly. I think it was Mike Pompeo, but it was some, just imperialist who was like, yeah, the Maduro government uses CLAP, which is this sort of like monthly, it's like a monthly food basket that the government provides people to sort of, it's like, staples like soap and like food, cornmeal, like milk. But, this sort of monthly box that Venezuelans receive is being explicitly targeted by U.S. sanctions. And the goal of that, the sort of intended, outcome of that policy is to diminish the support for the Venezuelan government. It's to, because this is like it's a major program. It's a very popular program of the government. Like, of course it is. They're providing food for people. And if they target this, they, really diminish a very material thing that the government is providing people. So they're targeting that program. They're targeting people that distribute it. But basically, like the Cuba blockade, the very explicit goal of the blockade against Venezuela is to limit what Venezuela can import. It's to limit what it can export, mainly its oil resources. So it has no money. Like 95% of Venezuela's government revenue came from oil sales. Now their oil production is like, it's like nothing. I mean, they don't produce oil anymore. They actually have a gas shortage in the country. All of this is being done to limit the amount of money they have on hand, to limit what they can import, and to starve the country. And that's exactly what they're doing. Like people, I was talking to a friend there. He said everyone in Venezuela, they work a job and then they have a side hustle. Like the way, the poorest and most oppressed people in our country work 2 or 3 jobs and work 60 to 70 hours a week. That's like everyone in Venezuela. That's literally everyone. They work like a 9 to 5 job, and then they work a side hustle so they can get US dollars, because the Bolivar doesn't purchase anything anymore, because all these, the sort of bourgeoisie in Venezuela collaborate to fix the prices. The US is constantly waging an economic war on Venezuela. They're sending, they're sucking the dollars out of the country through Colombia and, sending in Bolivar. There's a lot to it, but the bottom line is, I mean, it's the same policy that the U.S. has against Cuba and Iran and North Korea, it's not, in a way, it's not particular to Venezuela. Like, Venezuela is just one of several countries that is opposing U.S. hegemony in Latin America, and that's why they're getting the sort of, this end of the stick. So, yeah, different countries, different national characteristics, but it's the same. It's the same reason. It's the same policy.
Well, it's the policy of trying to stop socialism, because that's the biggest threat to global
Yes.
capital.
Yes.
And if socialism was such a failure, that that's what we're taught here in these imperialist countries, that socialism is a failure, capitalism is a great success. Meanwhile, people that live within these capitalist nations, there's poverty, homelessness. There's infrastructure issues, life expectancy is going down, living standards are going way down. People, especially here, don't have health care. People die of curable diseases. People don't have housing. People don't have education. And they need to stop socialism from succeeding. Otherwise, capitalism loses its meaning. Like, the reason why they need to, that's why they need to sanction socialist countries, because they need to stop it at all costs, because it's a threat to their imperialist system.
And this is what they've been doing since the Soviet Union. Like, this is the same. It's nothing new, right? It's like boom, 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 boom. So, why don't people make those connections? Like, oh, socialism doesn't work, but if you force it not to work, of course it's not going to work. But
yeah, I think this is actually the most important point. This is the most important takeaway, I think, from this discussion around sanctions. The reason the U.S., the number one reason the U.S. is blockading Cuba and blockading Venezuela is because socialism is a threat to the U.S. ruling class, is a threat to the U.S. bourgeoisie, because socialism is popular here. And if people in the United States see what's happening in Cuba, if they let Cuba live, if they let Cuba breathe, and they let the socialist system work the way it's supposed to, which is not under blockade, people in the United States are going to look to Cuba and say, hey, why don't we have that here? Why am I working 3 jobs and like drinking poisoned lead water?
Yeah.
Why do I have $100,000 of student debt when they don't have that in Cuba? Like, why don't we do what they're doing? And like Fox said, that's exactly what the United States' reaction to the Soviet Union was. That's what the US's reaction to socialism every time is to sabotage it. Like, the point of these blockades is to sabotage the socialist projects in Cuba and Venezuela, so the US can point to it and be like, look, socialism doesn't work, let's not try it. You don't want to end up like Cuba and Venezuela. But it's not a fair trial, because these countries aren't allowed to exist. Like, they're literally being choked by the United States. The United States, when the Soviet Union first formed, like, the United States and 14 imperialist nations immediately invaded the Soviet Union to try to crush the revolution. Mm-hmm. Like, they immediately invaded to try to, as Winston Churchill said, strangle the Bolshevik baby in its crib, because they knew, like, if socialism succeeded in that country, there would be socialist revolutions in other countries. And that's exactly what the Soviet Union inspired, was revolution in other countries. And when the Soviet Union, like, in the 30s and 40s and 50s, like, the Soviet Union inspired so many labor movements in the United States. People saw, the rapid advance of the Soviet Union, they said, why can't we have that here? Why can't, people in the United States, why can't workers in the United States, have rent that's capped at 7% of your income? Why can't, people have months of vacation time? I'm not talking about like bourgeois office workers. I'm talking about industrial workers, like factory workers, exactly. Taking month-long vacations. Like, this was inspiring to so many people around the world, to people in this country, especially Black Americans, this is also such an important point. Black people in the United States were especially inspired by the Soviet Union because of the Soviet Union's militant struggle against racism and militant struggle to end the national oppression of minorities in their country, in the Russian Empire. And there's a great article on liberationschool.org called Black Bolsheviks and White Lies, and it talks about the history of Black solidarity with the Soviet Union, and specifically all these lies that they tell about support for the Soviet Union and support for socialism in the United States. They have to lie about this because, if people in the United States knew that, not just Black people, but white people, Asian people, whoever, like, people in the United States historically have supported socialism, and that there have been socialist movements in the United States, especially among the most oppressed people in the United States, that would just set alarm bells off in the heads of most oppressed people today, in the heads of the 140 million people in this country who are in or near poverty. They would say, oh, well, all of our forefathers, our ancestors supported a socialist system. So everything I'm learning in school about socialism being a failure is incorrect. So, that's why the United States has to be the most anti-communist country in the world. That's why they have to tell all these lies about Cuba and Venezuela, but also the Soviet Union and China, is because if people knew the truth, people wouldn't support capitalism.
Well, also, I think there's just been a lot of work done to erase our socialist history in the United States. There's been numerous figures and groups and movements, like the Black Panthers, Eugene Debs, and Lindsay Foster, for example. And there was a very powerful and influential Communist Party in the United States. And I think all that kind of gets erased from our collective history. We get kind of indoctrinated with like bourgeois history and culture. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we need to really have a movement of getting to the masses with like proletarian history and culture, because it's really rich here. And once people start to see that, I think they'll be more open to seeing what's going on in other countries that are socialist and how we need to stand in solidarity with people abroad. But I think that's already happening here, because I think we, like what we saw during the Palestine protests here in America. I think people, the working class, are seeing that imperialism does not benefit them. Imperialism works against them, and it only benefits a select few, class of people. And I think being in solidarity, not just with the people within our borders, but abroad, I think the working class is awakening to that.
Yeah. I think like when it comes to anti-imperialist politics, people that call themselves anti-imperialists, like, I think there's a problem where people lean too heavily in the direction of, I mean, you can't lean too heavily in one direction or the other, but people really emphasize the international aspect, which is important. They emphasize what's happening in China. They emphasize, they talk about Venezuela and Cuba, which is important. It's important to study these countries, absolutely, because the United States lies about their history, lies about the history of socialism and the success of socialism in these countries. But also, like, I think a part that really gets neglected by people who call themselves anti-imperialist is that the rot of imperialism, like the real rot and the disgusting, like, consequences of imperialism, are also here in the United States. Like, the fact that people in, like, rural parts of the country, like, their water is being privatized by the local city governments. Like, they build schools on top of waste dumps and hospitals on top of waste dumps, and people get sick and die and they don't know why. Like, the fact that there are no jobs in these places is, that's the rot of imperialism. The fact that there are 17 million vacant homes in this country, but we still have mass homelessness in like every city. The fact that 67% of people who go bankrupt in this country go bankrupt because of medical bills, because they can't pay their medical bills in the so-called richest country in the world. If you're an anti-imperialist, you have to talk about the poverty in this country, because the reason there's poverty in this country is because the United States is so fixed as a capitalist empire. All it can do is fixate on profit and get and attaining profit by looting the rest of the world, by looting all these countries, by looting Latin America and Asia and Africa now. That it does nothing for people here. Imperialism does nothing for people in the United States. It's a policy of neglecting the people in the United States in order to benefit the select few at the top. So, in order to inspire and in order to teach people about imperialism, you don't tell people imperialism is just in China or it's just in Cuba. Imperialism is right around you. I mean, that's what Thomas Sankara said. Imperialism's on your dinner plate. Imperialism is the water that comes out of your faucet that comes out brown. Imperialism is the fact that, people are starting GoFundMes to fund their brain surgeries. That's imperialism.
Right.
And, if we're going to be anti-imperialist, like, people talk a lot about speaking to people where they're at. I mean, where are they? Like, they're in the forgotten cities, as Donald Trump called them. The poorest people in these countries are literally forgotten, and Donald Trump didn't give a damn about these people. But he did say one thing which I think spoke to them deeply, which is that the corrupt, disgusting, rich elite political class in Washington, D.C. does not care about them, or anyone for that matter in this country. And I think a lot of people in this country feel forgotten, and it's not because of the globalists, it's not because of the Jewish conspiracy or whatever. It's because of imperialism. It's because of the capitalist class. It's because capitalism doesn't give a fuck about the poor people in this country. So I really think we need to connect those things. We need to connect the international with the domestic. We need to, every time we talk about Cuba, like, it's important to talk about Cuba, but we have to talk about it in the context of, like, what does this country have to offer in the human rights conversation in the world? Who the hell is the United States to tell Cuba they don't have human rights? We don't have human rights. This country's never had human rights. I mean, for some people, you have literally, for most people in this country, you have never experienced human rights in the United States, especially Black people in the United States, especially indigenous people in the United States have never been treated fully as citizens, as human beings in the United States. So the United States has no right to speak about human rights in Cuba or anywhere else. And, until it can, it'll never serve its people, because it's a capitalist empire, and that's what it's designed to do, is deprive people of their rights.
Exactly. And I think you make a really good point. And I actually tried to do something similar the other day when I was talking with people about Cuba, and I was trying to make connections between Cuba and the DPRK, and how the United States has been equally aggressive to them, how they've had each of their backs. They're good people. The people are the government, and the military there, like, they are autonomous people in control of their destinies. And I got, the typical, the Kims are monarchs, and the Kims are the people worship the Kims, and I'm just like, okay, but they also have houses. They also have, they also have healthcare, like, we bare minimum stuff that we don't have here.
Yeah.
We don't have here. Who are we to tell them that they need to get rid of their government, that they need to, stop oppressing their people? But if they feed, house, and cure them of preventable illnesses, they're like eons ahead of the United States in every every step of the way. Like, even under these brutal sanctions, they still hold on to a lot of their principles, and they house people, and they feed people. And I mean, children in North Korea can make cotton out of rocks to make their own clothes. We can't do that here. We can't do that here. I travel through the Midwest to go to my hometown, and I just see trash. People live in trash. Even here in Chicago, people live in trash. what you said really meant a lot to me. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I mean, our enemies are not abroad. They're not in socialist countries. They're not what our these like bourgeois politicians are telling us our enemies are. Our enemies are right here at home. They're on Wall Street. They are the major banks. They are, the military-industrial complex. They're it's all these multinational, international corporations, and they're all right here in America. And I think I think people are starting to wake up to that, but it's important for us to get out to them and explain that those who our enemies are, because I think people are finally, the working class in America is waking up to that. And I think that's why we still see these desperate attempts to kind of point the finger at these socialist countries and trying to depict them as human rights abusers, and their system doesn't work, or whatever our bourgeois media tries to say about it. But I think people aren't buying that anymore. I think that's kind of starting to dissipate, as long as our imperialist empire is in decay, because that's what it is right now.
Yeah. Asada Shakur said, "Never let someone tell you who your enemies are," and I think I would add to that, especially never let rich people tell you who your enemy is, because they don't give a fuck about you. But I think it's also, as the conditions in the United States deteriorate, as the social conditions in the United States deteriorate, especially, and I think you alluded to this, Eric, you'll see more and more people realize, like, how could what the United States be saying about this country be true? Because the whole sort of American mentality rests on the American dream and American exceptionalism. This idea that America is this unique country where anyone can go from the bottom and rise to the top, and anyone can just pull themselves up by their bootstraps or whatever and make it. And so many people, more and more people, are seeing the hard, cold reality of the United States and of imperialism and of the rot in the imperial core. They're working hard. Americans are supposed to work hard. If you work hard, you'll make it. People work 70 hours a week, 60, 70 hours a week, and they can't even make rent. What about them? Like, they're not making it. Like,
and that's not because of some of another poor person. That's because of a capitalist. And we live in the most locked up, surveilled state in the world. And that's not because of another poor person or an immigrant or some other foreign country. It's because of our imperialist empire and the capitalist class who control it. And those are the people who are our enemies. They're the ones who make us work 60, 80 hours a week, multiple jobs, no benefits, like you said, like dirty, contaminated water and food that's poisoning everyone and giving everyone cancer. That has nothing to do with anyone outside our borders. It's all right here. Our enemies are right here, and they are these big capitalist industries, and those who own and operate them, and the banks. That's who our enemies are. It's not each other. It's a different class, and they're the ones who control our government.
And the left really has to be clear on this idea, because we're not alone in like wanting to win over the working class. Like, there are also fascists who are just as eager to change the sort of liberal democracy in the United States and overturn it with an authoritarian right-wing fascist state. And they're reaching out. They're reaching out to these same people, these people in the forgotten cities, and saying, why you don't have a good job and why you don't make good pay is because immigrants are coming to this country and they're stealing your jobs. It's because China is, the capitalists are shipping jobs to China. It's Chinese people's fault. They're taking your jobs. And, whatever, it's the globalists and the Jewish conspiracy, and all these people are, conspiring against you, white man. But really, it's exactly what you said. And that's the biggest irony of this is that it's the capitalist that's importing cheap labor and exploiting undocumented labor for even less than minimum wage. They can pay them even less than the legal wage. They're getting exploited harder than the poor white person in a rural part of America. They're being pitted against each other. They're fighting over jobs which are decreasing ever so slightly in wages. The wages keep going down because they're being pitted against each other and forced to compete against one another by the same person. They're being pitted against each other by the same capitalist. And if those two people, if the immigrants and Chinese people, whoever, unite with the white working class, then it's over. It's over.
Exactly.
It's over.
Yeah, and that's why they want to keep us divided. That's why also the synthetic left, they work in the interest of the imperialists because they think all white people are just like automatically bourgeois and are not revolutionary, and that just defies science, that just defies history. And they work. They're a counter gang as well. They're the opposite counter gang. They work in the interest of the rich imperialist elites, and that's why we need to get to people with actual Marxism. It's about uniting all of us together, no matter what color or religion you are, because that's not what our issues are. Our issue is rooted in class. It's the class struggle and the class dynamic of our country. We need to change the class character and the political power. It needs to be in our hands and not a select elite few, because those are the people who hate America. Those are the people who are destroying this country. It's not anyone else. It's not a black person. It's not a Jewish person. It's not an immigrant. It's not any other poor working class person. It's the bourgeoisie. It's the imperialists, and we need to replace them with we need to replace our bourgeois dictatorship with a worker state, because it not only will it benefit us, it'll benefit the rest of the world and our global community.
Yeah, just to speak to that mentality, like if you like are opposed to working and organizing white people in the United States, then you have a huge problem. Like you can't really call yourself a communist. Like
Right.
As communists, we evaluate the material reality, the circumstance of our countries, and the circumstance of the United States is that 70% of people are white. So if you don't have them on your side, you don't have the masses on your side. And like if that's really your attitude, like I was saying, like the fascists have no problem organizing white people. The fascists are talking to them. Hell, they don't even have a problem talking to people of color. I mean, you look at the Proud Boys. They don't exclude based on race. They exclude based on ideology. They exclude you if you're a communist. They want to kill you if you're a communist, and they'll recruit any black or Latino person that's willing to kill communists. Their leader is like a right wing Cuban Tarek something. He's not white. He has brown skin. He's Latino, but he hates communists, and that's what unites all of these people. And sometimes I really that attitude. I mean, I think you said it right. Like whether or not these people feel like they're supporting capitalism or the imperialism, that's essentially what they're doing tacitly if they're not willing to organize white people in the United States. I mean, that's such a ridiculous idea to me. And these are often people who talk about the Black Panthers and Chairman Fred Hampton, who organized with the Young Patriots. I mean, so
it's a racial fetishization. It's a racial fetishization. Fetishization. It's a racial fetishization. That's really hard to say.
It is hard to say.
Does it make sense though? Like that's totally what.
Yes.
That's totally what that is. Like it's just like this faction on the left. They regurgitate pseudoscience and call it communism, and then they fetishize people like Asada Shakur and Angela Davis and you're right, Fred Hampton, and it really frustrates me because Um, I don't even need to explain it to you. We already like covered all of that. I'm
Yeah,
poor.
I mean, they just like red wash them, basically. I guess you could say they like red wash them and make them out to be like these like these like identitarian like race reductionist
Yeah.
people or groups, and that's just not it at all.
Yeah.
Um, they're Marxist Leninists,
Yeah, and they're serious about winning. Like they
right?
don't they're not doing this to like have the best politics or to like, be seen as like, oh, like all my, I'm not friends with white people. Like people like to they like they're proud of saying that, or they like to like they think it's like cool to be like that or something. Like these people they're talking about were serious about winning, and if you're serious about winning, you'll take anyone on your side. Anyone who supports socialism, anyone who's going to put work in, you will take. You can't afford to throw people aside. You can't afford to throw white people who want to overthrow capitalism to the curb. Like, how could you do that? This is a country of 330 million
Right.
people. How many communists do you think? How many dedicated communists do you think are in the country right now? Like, there aren't that many. Like, we really aren't in a position to be kicking people to the curb. Like, we need to get from thousands to millions.
Yeah.
And like, I will take whoever that is. I'm sorry.
No, yeah, and we
I'm
we
with
shouldn't
you.
we shouldn't like we shouldn't turn away from people who have backwards ideas, because those backward ideas are bourgeois ideas. They're been indoctrinated into people's minds, and the only way to really change that is to improve people's material conditions. And I
And
think
do people think like people of color don't have backwards ideas? Like, have
exactly
you ever if you study Huey Newton, Assata Shakur, like any Black Panther, you read their autobiographies, they'll talk about how they had 100 backwards ideas, and they had to learn they had to learn what was wrong about their ideas. They had to correct their own ideas. They had to, learn through experience. I mean, Huey Newton had very homophobic ideas, and it was through organizing with gay people that he realized these people aren't my enemies. Like, these are some of the most militant people I've met. Like, Asada Shakur, there's a part in her autobiography where she talks about how she supported the Vietnam War when she was younger, like, because she didn't know better.
right.
She grew up in the United States. Like, how many, like, you watch the TV in the US for 5 seconds, you're gonna sound like a gun-toting like warmonger,
Right.
Like, how can you
Right.
blame her?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
We,
exactly. So go ahead, Fox.
um, I I do want to talk about Twitter bots before we get too far off the plot here,
Mm.
because I'm really enjoying what we're saying. But I really, really want to know what's going on with these Twitter bots, or are tankies just making shit up again? Like, what's the process of sussing out these fake bots? How do we know it's bullshit? And how do we know we're not just dumb larper tankies?
Yeah, it's like another one of those things where like, the socialists and the communists say something, they've been saying something for years, and like finally people are realizing, oh, they weren't kidding about that. So yeah, I mean, if you haven't been like brigaded by anti-communist Cubans yet, you're definitely missing out, and you're not doing your part in the sort of online info war that's taking place. But anyone that's posted like anything positive about Cuba in the last week or two has probably been brigaded by all these accounts with like the Cuban like fist and like, all this. And especially on Twitter, you'll see these accounts with like a name and like a string of letters, or you could just check when the account was created. A lot of them were created in like June or April or July of this year, and there have been Twitter users who have like gone through and done serious analysis. I showed an analysis that one Twitter user did in one of the videos I made about this, where he goes through 2 million tweets. He analyzed 2 million tweets, and a lot of the people that have been pushing out this SOS Cuba hashtag, like their accounts have been made like they were made during the protests. They were made July 10th and July 11th when these protests were already happening. and they just tweet. They have no followers, and all they do is tweet about Cuba. One of the first account to tweet SOS Cuba during the protests was tweeting 5 times a second. So unless this person is doing like crazy like finger yoga to prepare for the Cuban protests or some shit, like, it's just ridiculous. And the worst part of this is, I mean, like the most revealing part, I guess you should say, is that the same fucking thing happened during the SOS Nicaragua movement and the SOS Bolivia movement.
Mhm.
And they're literally copy pasting in every single one of these things. They have this like copy pasted message like, we the Cuban people like do not support the Cuban government, da 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 da. Like
It's so crazy. It's so crazy.
it's
And
like,
it's always in English.
and it's so poorly, it's all right, it's all in English, it's all in English too, they all conveniently speak English, but it's just like so poorly done. Like I really don't think it's really like as bad as it looks. Like there's no like added context you're missing. There's nothing like, it's just fake. Like it's just that it is exactly what you're looking at. It's just a fake shitty bot campaign. And they think it fools people, and more like, like we've been talking about, the more they do this, the more they try to regime change countries. Like they tried Libya, they tried Syria, they tried Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and now they're doing Cuba. And I think a lot of people, especially young people who are on social media, are jaded at this point, and they're like, I've seen this before, I know this before, I've seen, Bana Alabed say, oh,
Oh my
USA, please bomb my country. They remember Ahmed Shalabi, who was, calling for regime change in Iraq. And now, they remember Juan Guaido. They remember all these people. And now when, these Miami Cubans, when Pitbull is on the internet
Oh
calling
my
for like,
God.
when the mayor of, Miami is calling for airstrikes on Cuba, like, it's like, we've seen this before. We have seen these reactionary right-wing exiled refugees in the United States call for regime change in their countries before. We've seen these fake Twitter bot operations before. We've seen it all. I mean, we've seen so much. We've seen the white helmets. We've seen, mobile chemical weapons labs and the, WMD. We've seen just about everything. As Americans, we have seen just about every psyop you could possibly concoct from the CIA. So I think people have seen it all. And I think that's why this SOS Cuba thing is just like falling apart as soon as it began. It just fell apart. Really.
Yeah.
I mean, I honestly, I think it's kind of backfired in a way. I almost feel like the way anti-imperialists really mobilize, honestly online, but also, have demonstrated around the world, is a victory. Like we just kind of smashed this narrative. Like we were waiting for this narrative to come in. We just destroyed it.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot more. I think there's a lot more anti-imperialist media out there, like the news outlet that you work for, BT News.
Yes.
And
Yes.
our channel and numerous other channels where we offer a anti-imperialist and Marxist lens on things that are going on in the world and here at home. So I think that also is plays a big role in that, and we hope
It also
that
helps when you're hot.
oh
you guys are really hot. You guys are really hot. You're right.
Yes, it does.
Yes, that's why your channel's growing so quickly. I saw you pull Jackson Hinkle, and apparently, you're pulling
Tara
people.
Reid came and hung out with us. Oh my gosh.
Oh, that's
so
amazing. Congratulations.
fucking nice.
Yeah.
Thank you. But yeah, I think this is a great place to leave it, Kei. Before we wrap up, just let people remind people where they can find your work.
Yeah, it's called Breakthrough News at BT Newsroom on any social media, YouTube. We're there.
Awesome, and we look forward to having you on again soon.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.